Bill Zito spoke publicly and gave some updates on some injured players. And what is one rule that you would like to change in the NHL? We are going to discuss that more on today's Locked On Florida Panthers podcast.
You're Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into this Friday, August 18th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. I'm Armando Velez, and you can follow me on X at Bardown12. Follow the show account on X and Instagram at LO_FLA Panthers. And shout out there to the everydayers who come back here and get your daily Florida Panthers fix. So, Cats fans, Bill, like we said at the top, Bill Zito spoke to the media on the NHL Power Play show with Boomer Gordon and Jake Hahn, and we got a whole bunch of information, but it just don't know if we exactly got all of our questions answered as far as what we wanted to know about the statuses of certain players. We didn't get anything of the arena rights deal neither, but before we talk about that, it is Friday, which means it is Erik Fairbanks Friday edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Nick Fairbanks is back. Nick, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be back, and excuse me. Not a whole lot to talk about with Zito, I guess. David DeWerk did put out that article and everything, and, we'll go through it. But hopefully we'll have a little bit more news coming up in the next couple of weeks as the preseason will be starting.
Yeah, and based on the conversation that he had on the Sirius XM NHL Power Play show, it was a 10-minute appearance by the general manager of the Florida Panthers. Spoke about praising Matthew Caldwell on how the Florida Panthers brand has been built since their Stanley Cup final appearance. The really only thing we learned was that Bill Zito met Brooks Koepka. So chances are that Aaron Ekblad also met Brooks Koepka too. Chances are. Spoke really about and was asked a really important question on timeline on Brandon Montour and Aaron Ekblad. We've seen the videos of Brandon Montour in his rehab. Aaron Ekblad has been more on the quiet side as far as things. We know that during the offseason, he is one of the few people who stay in South Florida. Ryan Lomberg's another one who stays around town. And even though Brandon Montour made an appearance on the Cam and Strict podcast a few weeks ago, this conversation, like I said, with Bill Zito, 10 minutes long. Chances are Bill Zito and the PR department were saying, this is what we're going to give you. Usually in Bill Zito's media appearances, the few that he does, he's very enthusiastic. He's very long with his answers. But this one specifically didn't give a whole lot. And this is what he said about the injuries. 1 month? No. 4 months? Probably not. No timeline, but whatever the estimates were. So the fan in me wants to be frustrated in it, but being able to go to games, do interviews, and kind of understanding a little bit of how the PR game works a little bit. Don't have a complete grasp, but get a little bit of a sense of it, is also a little bit of an understanding that you don't want to make any false promises neither when it comes to these players coming back. What do you think?
You always have to limit your expectations. You don't want to give anything away to other clubs. And, for example, what if the whole defense is somehow miraculously healthy by opening night? I don't think you want the rest of the league to really know that. You want to get a good start to start the season. But on the other hand, you want to channel the expectations of the fans, just because I think coming into last season, a lot of people thought it was just going to be a a transition year. If they make the playoffs, that's amazing. If they didn't, understandable. But they made the Stanley Cup final. So I think just more or less being able to just stay in the lane and just, really keep options open and not give too much away is probably the best possible. And, him talking to Brooks Koepka, I'm surprised he didn't do it during the Stanley Cup finals or during the playoffs. I'm pretty sure there was a conversation or two, either beforehand or during. But, I just that's a nothing burger for me.
Yeah, because Brooks Koepka did bang the drum before Game 4 of the Stanley Cup final. Of course, there was a conversation prior to that. He probably went into the locker room after a morning skate or something. Once the media was gone, of course. Also spoke about asked about the liquidity of the guys with 1 year left. He asked if it's stressful or great. A little bit of both. I'm sure Bill Zito is looking way ahead. And I know we spoke about this a few weeks ago about not being married to the current salary cap space, knowing that you can't expect a whole bunch of 7-year deals from guys outside of the organization to come in as well. And if you do, probably only expect one, if anything. If you're going to give someone a long-term deal, it's just based on the cap projections. Of course, escrow is going to be completely paid off. At least the expectation is this year as well. And he also spoke about things that we've also spoken about, how turnover helps them get through, but chances for younger guys. And we've spoken about all the young guys who have to get in the mold, who have to, and when you're a contender, you have to hit on those guys. We spoke about a Lundell. We've spoken about a Grigory Denisenko. We spoke about Lucas Karlsson and all that stuff. So a little bit of what Bill Zito has spoken about too, but also gave a lot of praise for Evan Rodriguez as well towards the end of the conversation about a guy who can fit on every line that he's been on. Of course, spoke about fitting in with Sidney Crosby, fitting in with Nathan McKinnon just last year as well. And also, we are not the only ones who talk about the Atlantic Division. The front office is also one who talks about the Atlantic Division as well, on how it's a division that has gotten tougher, especially with a lot of expectations, maybe that Buffalo could take that next step up. So some of the things that we are kind of thinking is a little bit of what the front office is thinking, of course, but they are more advanced in this. They are more experts on the cap than us as well. They have their whole analytics department as well. But those are basically what Bill Zito said, and I didn't come out of that conversation knowing more than what we already have been talking about in this offseason.
Definitely. And, the thing about it is, what is he supposed to say right now? I mean, we talked about managing expectations and, giving an update on the injured players, but, what else is there to talk about? I mean, you don't know what other teams are going to look like, essentially. I mean, on the ice, they can look good on paper, but they have to come together on the ice. Buffalo is one of those teams that I think may have somewhat figured it out into last season, because every single year for the last couple of years, they would always go on a hot streak and then immediately right after just fall off a cliff. So it's either the coaching or the culture that changed there, and we'll see if they take the next step. Don't be surprised if Detroit's in the mix too with the moves that they've made this summer. They've swapped out 4 of their 6 defensemen, so they'll be much tougher to play against. Mm-hmm. And Ottawa, we'll see what they do. I mean, they did sign Tarasenko, but I still don't think that fixes their problems. And, again, they're just looking ahead to see what exactly other teams are doing. Florida did have a very successful offseason considering the cap and what they were able to bring in and who they're trying to give a chance to. As you said, with the cap, this gives a chance for guys to step up. And if they want longer term deals, I think of a Reinhart, I think of a Denisenko, Lundell, who's going to need a bridge deal or an extension. Change is good, and also adversity is good. So I can only think that, we'll see how this team comes together and performs within the first month or two, considering the injuries that they have, and they have to have people stand up.
Yeah, and one thing that you spoke about with Detroit is turning over their blue line, and that one of them includes Jeff Petrie, whose father was a relief pitcher or starting pitcher. I'm not sure. He was a pitcher for the Detroit Tigers back in the day. So pretty cool homecoming for Jeff Petrie himself. But we're gonna continue this conversation, and we're going to go into a topic that we haven't really dug deep into ever since this transaction happened. But we're going to discuss in segment number 2 with the Pittsburgh Penguins trading for Erik Karlsson. What does that do to the Eastern Conference and the Florida Panthers? We're going to discuss that and more here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. But first, we're going to tell you all about FanDuel Sportsbook. And football season is about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you a chance to win all season long, because right now when you bet a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets for every victory. You can place bonus bets on spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets on America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Segment number 2 here on this Friday, August 18th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. It's another edition of Fairbanks Friday with myself and Nick Fairbanks. And Nick, I mentioned here and there for the past few weeks about the Pittsburgh Penguins trading for Erik Karlsson. Haven't really gone too much into detail of it, but Florida was in somewhat the running, not really, but then knew that it was out of their price range as far as what they were willing to give up. And as far as that trade itself, I think the San Jose Sharks got fleeced in it. But when it's that high of a cap hit, you're just trying to get rid of some money, and honestly, with an aging roster of the San Jose Sharks, that's just trying to get those contracts to expire, and likely going to be the worst team in the NHL, more than likely. Philadelphia are up there as well. But when it comes to the deal for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and the people listening are probably thinking, why are we talking about a metropolitan team as far as a threat to the Florida Panthers? Is because at this moment in time, and that could change, I'm not ready to put in Sharpie that the Florida Panthers are going to be finished in the top 3 of the Atlantic Division. I know things can change, and I'm not going to give my predictions yet as far as where they finish. I actually joined a Kirby loophole on Twitter Spaces last week, and everyone was giving their predictions on the Atlantic Division. I actually stayed silent, had my mic muted. And Kirby messaged me after, I wish you gave your predictions. I told him I'm saving it for before the season starts. So in case those people who happen to be on Spaces did not hear my predictions. But as far as that, the Kyle Dubas, what a job that he did with getting rid of contracts like we mentioned Jeff Petrie in the previous segment. Casey DeSmith, who's not gonna probably get a whole bunch of games in Pittsburgh. Well, depending on the injury situation to Tristan Jarry. If he's healthy, then that's a contract they were able to get off their books. And then doing some of the wrong that Ron Hextall did with getting rid of the Mikael Granlund contract as well. And you gain cap space as well. Mm-hmm. So what a fantastic trade as far as cap reasons go. But chances are Chris Letang is going to be on power play too. They could be on the first pairing. I know there's criticisms for Erik Karlsson on the defensive side of the puck. And what he can do offensively, it might not be 100 points, but a point per game for a defenseman, that poses a somewhat threat. And actually, I actually listened to our episode back on July 7th on bottom of the barrel contenders, meh, and true contenders of the Eastern Conference. And I still put Pittsburgh in the meh category, Nick, but they're not as far down in that category. They're a little bit of a step up, but if there's few guys that you don't count out, it's Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin as well. And then adding Erik Karlsson to their power play as well, which statistically, the Penguins were average in almost every single category, like 16th in the NHL in a lot of categories. But now adding this piece really makes them, leaves less of a question mark for them. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And does Erik Karlsson give them the extra point that they needed to make the playoffs last year? That's my question to Pittsburgh Penguins fans, and probably does. But at the end of the day, San Jose could not really, how should I say, manufacture the deal that they wanted. Karlsson basically forced their hand to make a trade. They didn't want to pay him the money anymore. So it was kind of like a mutual thing, but at the same time, you know, you weren't going to have a lot of people who were going to buy that cap hit at all. So you had to get Montreal involved. So I think if you were to go to the tiers of who won the trade, it's going to be Pittsburgh with Karlsson and then offloading all those extra contracts that were dead weight to them, especially Granlund. And then you go Montreal and then you go San Jose. You know, I think it's kind of funny that Mike Hoffman is on the San Jose Sharks. He's actually stuck there longer than he did last time. I think last time was like 7 to 8 hours, but
less than a day.
Exactly. So I think with what Pittsburgh's doing, it's a last hurrah. I don't expect Karlsson to be the exact same player he was on San Jose because he was the guy. You know, he's going to provide more possession, more skating, and more offense. But let's be honest, Pittsburgh needs defense. And I'm still questionable about their goaltending. Jari and DeSmith did not impress me at all. I thought they were very beatable. And you're bringing in a defenseman who's all offense, and then you have Chris Letang, who's getting older, who's mostly offense, can play some defense. Who else do you have? You know, you're just relying, again, on the formula that your forwards are going to get you through and everything. And now they're another year older. Are they going to be able to take the grind again? Are they going to be healthy? I know Malkin's been in and out of the lineup. Crosby's been more healthy. But, you know, who knows what happens? Maybe he – and I don't mean to say this, you know, I'm not putting a hex on him or anything, but what happens if he takes another hit? You know, he's taken some pretty nasty ones in his career. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. You know, it seems like Dubas is making Pittsburgh into kind of mini Toronto in a way. He's got his 4 again. And that didn't really work out for him too much. Florida made sure of that. And, you know, we'll see what happens with Pittsburgh. I still put him on the map, but Karlsson may get them a few more points, but I don't think he's going to be the game changer they think he's going to be. I think he maxed out last year just to up his trade value, and unfortunately, it just didn't pan out that way for the Sharks. They should have gotten more for him, but the cap hit. And one little note I want to leave on that, think of Sergei Bobrovsky. That's one thing that I would probably pay attention to see the return on Karlsson and see how that could relate to Bob. I know it's a different position, but the cap hit is a major issue.
Yeah, and when it comes to Karlsson, I'm looking at their daily faceoff right now, where the top 4, I'm actually pretty okay with their top 4 as far as deep pairs. Ryan Graves is actually a guy that I was hoping to see that the Panthers would probably like bring in for a talk for a meeting as well. Marcus Pettersson as well in that top 4, and then we haven't mentioned this guy, Riley Smith, former Panther, as well, is going to be part of that. They get the Golden Knights on their end, they get a little younger with bringing Barbashev back and then putting dishing out Riley Smith. So that's a smart move by Vegas on that side. I think that both teams can in fact benefit there. The only really bad contract really there is Jeff Carter. That's really one that's probably the worst contract on the team. His contract for what he brings to the table is great. And that was before a lot of changes as far as deals in the NHL as well, and brought in Nola Chari. We know what he is at this point, and just a bottom 6 grinder as well. So, but improved. Maybe they don't lose that game against the Chicago Blackhawks, and we have a different type of offseason as well for the Florida Panthers as far as what we even talk about and how we're just overall feeling about this offseason going into the 2023-24 season. But we're going to park that conversation here, and we are going to transition to segment number 3, where we're going to discuss what rule change we would like to see in the NHL. We're going to discuss that more here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast.
Your Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
segment on this Friday, August 18th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast with Nick Fairbanks here. And Nick, this idea came last night as I was scrolling through Instagram, and Bardown had a tweet and an Instagram post on what if there was one rule change that you would have in the NHL, what would it be? And before pre-recording, we were discussing the topics, but I don't know what yours is. I don't know what your rule change is, but I remember you saying, "Oh, I'm ready for this one." So, what I want to ask you and have you go first here. What is one rule change that you would like to implement in the National Hockey League?
So I'm doing this for my own sanity, and I'm doing this for the sanity of all hockey fans, because this is one rule that nobody understands. Nobody ever calls it correctly. It's always up to interpretation. Goaltender interference. Right now, as the rule lies, is that when an opposing player makes avoidable contact with the goalie, either inside or outside of the crease, the player doesn't try to avoid contact, it is considered goaltender interference. How many times have we seen a guy get pushed into a goaltender, not by his own player, but by a defenseman, and he hits a goalie, and then they call it goaltender interference? Like, he could have stopped, or, maybe he, accidentally clips a skate or something like that. And they let the goal through. I know Florida's been on the butt end of a lot of these. I know there's a controversial goal that Tkachuk scored in the Game 4 of Eastern Conference Finals that Carolina wanted as goaltender interference. This may backfire on that, but I would, under my rule change, I would agree with that. I think if there's any contact with the goaltender that is not, how should I say? The intent is, to me, is irrelevant. It's if the goalie is touched and it's not because of a defenseman or sliding into the goalie, that's goaltender interference, clear as day. If you're interfering with the way that the goaltender plays his position, it's goaltender interference. And I think it should just be black and white. Intent shouldn't matter. And, to me, I think I would just simplify it. And, I don't think that there should be much debate about that, to be honest.
Yeah, and then you see situations where the goalie's skates, the back end of the skates, are right on the edge of the crease as well, and that you're talking just inches as well, as far as that is, and that's the frustrating part about the rule. Which, as far as interpretation, that is probably the hardest one to figure out. It's like, what is it? What is it not? And we've been debating that for years on what it is. I kind of wish that the NHL and hockey in general can just go to the VAR kind of the system where you can detect where the goalie's skates are in the crease and as well as the skater as well, and safety with offside as well. The reviews in soccer are so quick. It's stupid how the NFL and NHL are the ones that actually take the most time as far as reviewing plays as far as that. For me, I would like to see two things. I would like to see overtime in the regular season extended to 10 minutes. And if by the 5-minute mark you don't see any score 3-on-3, the next whistle, after a whistle for a stoppage, you make it 4-on-4. As far as that, I think that would be a cool incentive for some creativity as well. I know there's less open ice. I get that, but something a little different as far as progressing the game as well. And another, as long as I've watched hockey, it's been the 2 points for win, 1 for overtime loss, and 0 for a regulation loss. But I would like to see more of this. I would like to see a regulation win be 3, an overtime win 2, an overtime loss 1, and a regulation loss 0. Because I am so annoyed at times whenever it's a minute left, it's a tie game, and you see the guys playing for a point. They're playing not to lose instead of playing to win. And I think this would incentivize guys to go more for the win, especially in the last 10 games of the season where every point matters as well. And also, I would change the tie-breaking rules too. It is stupid. It is so stupid that the NHL's first tiebreaker is not head-to-head. How is it not head-to-head? The NFL does it, and the NBA, I believe, does it as well. How does the how if you swept an opponent, but they have more regulation or regulation overtime wins? How the hell is that the first tiebreaker? Which it's been a long time since I've gone on a little rant, but here it is. How is that not the first tiebreaker too? So
I think, I mean, just to kind of, I mean, you answer your own question, I think, with the previous rule that you wanted to change with the points. It's just because, with soccer and with hockey, they're points-based systems. Now, if you go away from points-based and you go based on record like the other leagues do, then I think you have a much better argument into what, the head-to-head, records say. But the fact is that, when the points come down to it, you have to take into consideration the other teams and the other games that they've played, how many goals they've possibly scored if they have that tiebreaker as well. It's just, I agree with you in the fact that they overcomplicate it, much like the goaltender interference. But I also think that they do it to try to make everything as fair as possible and to create as much parity as possible as well. So that would just be my insight into that.
Yeah, and let's also think about what the loser point also means for a lot of general managers, where if you look at point percentage and you're closer to 500 as well, but you have a whole bunch of overtime losses, that gives more incentives for GMs to say, hey, look at this. I got us at least to above 500 and closer to a playoff spot, when that could be a little bit of an illusion as well to how their team really is and what their team is not as well. So I also think that's also a thing of job security too, not just parity, but job security as well. So I think that's an incentive when it comes to that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in business, you always try to, exemplify your strengths, right? And, you acknowledge your weaknesses, but you don't necessarily like bring them out into public, but you always talk about your strengths. And I think one of the things that you do as a general manager, kind of like what Bill Zito was doing, is like, 1 month, probably not. 4 months, definitely not. Like, he's being positive, in my opinion, with that. And then, anytime, you're talking about a tough situation or something that may look like it's rotting from the outside, you always kind of want to, make it look better, polish something that you probably shouldn't. And I won't say what it is, but, you always want to make things look better than they really are. And I think as Florida Panthers fans over the years, we've fallen into that. We've had a bunch of overtime games. The team is still in it. They're gaining at least a point. All we got as a point was a favorite acronym. And it always gave us fans false hope because they were still in it until the end. Mm-hmm. Good for business, but at the same time, is this team really going anywhere? And are they going to make the changes necessary to not have to rely on all we got as a point?
Yeah, I remember Frank was especially very vocal as far as the whole, at least they got a point as well. And I know if there was ever that opportunity for that point system, they would do what's known, we've learned this in school, the SWOT analysis, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as well. So that is definitely one that would be evaluated if that conversation ever happens in the league office, which I don't think it currently is one as well. But Nick, I want to thank you so much for joining me on this edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. This was another fun one, a very fun Fairbanks Friday edition of the show. Tell everybody where they can follow you online.
Armando, thank you again. Yeah, really exhilarating episode, especially with Bill Zito talking and everything. But everybody can find me on the X at Prudentia0, or you guys can find me on Threads at Bure1096. Can't wait to see what happens in the hockey world in the next week. We are 1 week closer to the beginning of the season. I think we're at like 56 now. So hold on. We're almost there, guys.
Yes, for sure. And we're one step closer to hockey. So thank you, Nick, and I'll see you next week, my friend.
See you next week.
And if you like what you're hearing, please Please subscribe to the podcast to be notified every single time the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast jumps into your podcast feed. Don't forget to also subscribe to the other shows on the Locked On NHL network, including Locked On NHL, Locked On Fantasy Hockey with Flip Livingstone and Stu Roden, and Locked On NHL Prospects. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. So I'm Armando Velez with Nick Fairbanks, and you've been listening to the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day.